We're going to be looking at using the type tool as well as bringing in images in order to do a magazine layout. First of all, with the type tool, there's a number of choices available to us here. I'm just going to detach that so that they're all available. First off, in using the type tool, if we drag, we create a container for type, which is automatically filled by an entity that we call Greek text or lorem ipsum. It's not Greek. In fact, it's actually written in Latin. It's just there as a design tool so that designers can work on doing layouts of posters or magazine spreads without the necessity of having the finished copy. Oftentimes, the copy is the last thing to be approved, but that shouldn't hold back the design and production process. So lorem ipsum is an important tool in the arsenal of a designer, and it just allows us to continue to work up until the time that the client has finished and approved the text or the editor. So that's area type. The thing about area type is, I'm just going to go to the selection tool, is it exists inside a container. I can make that container larger or I can make it smaller. You'll notice as it gets smaller than the amount available text, you see this red plus sign inside a square. That's indicating an overflow situation. Now, in an overflow situation, you do one of two things. You either make the container larger or you make the type smaller. The other option, a third option that's open to you, is to build another container and link that second container or third container to the original and allow the text to flow through that chain of containers. And the way in which you do that is by clicking on the red plus sign, and it gives you your loaded text icon. And once you've got that, you can drag out another text container and another text container until all the text has been flowed out. Now I want you to notice that at any time, I just double click in there to get a text insertion point. I'm just going to start adding text and watch what happens to the flow through. Think of the text as being very much like water. Okay? You notice what happened. The type automatically reflowed itself. If I go back to my selection tool, you can see how these things are connected. This flows to this to this, and this to this. So it's showing us the way in which these things are being reflowed. Now, at any time, if I were to pick it up here, I could specify a new flow. Pick that up there for a very different configuration of text boxes. My question is, what happens to text in a box that gets deleted? There's my question. It's one of those burning life questions. So we've got the text right there. I'm going to select it, and then I'm going to delete it. Well, what happens to the text? The container disappears from the chain, but the text does not. It's simply reflowed to the elements in the chain below it. So it's just redistributed. Text, like water, flows downhill. If I add text in here, it's only going to affect those containers below it in the chain. So any overflow caused here will come down this little pipe here and start filling up this area here. If I add text in here, it overflows into here, overflow from here, then goes into here. So think of it like water flowing downhill. So that's area type. What other types are there? There's point type. So if I take my text tool and I simply click down, this is point type. That's different in that if I make the box larger, the type gets larger. And that type can be set okay? We can make that as long as we want it. We can scale it down. Goodness me, we can even invert it. Upside down and backwards. So we have a lot of control over that. Now, what if we want to convert one to the other? I want to start the text wrapping to the next line. By the way, you should never distort type. When scaling type, you should always use the Shift key. Distorting type is kind of like purchasing a Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow and then taking it to a chop shop and doing all manner of grotesque things to it. You pay for the design. A great amount of time and effort goes into ensuring the best design, and the same is true of type. It takes a long time to figure out what each character is going to look like, how much space each character will occupy, and how much space between each pair of characters there will be. You want to avail yourself of all of that thinking. So never distort type. That's just a straight off rule of thumb. Now, how do we convert point type to area type? That was the question. See this little handle right here? If you double click that, notice the icon right now is indicating a little T inside a box. That means if I double click, notice how it becomes a solid. And notice how the icon is now changed to a T with a little bar underneath it, indicating if I double click now, it'll convert it back to area type. Double click it again, it's now area type. How do we know? Well, let me make the box larger. See how it's reflowing? So that's area type. What happens if I convert this back to point type? Double click. Now if I stretch this, what happens? It keeps the same typeset, the same lines intact, but now it allows us to make it larger and smaller on the fly. That's a good thing to know about how to use that. We can have a path. So I just got my pen tool here. And I'm going to use this Type on a Path tool. And I just click on it. And now I'm going to select that type. I'm going to make it much larger. And again, I'm going to go back to my selection tool. And I want you to notice these markers here. This is for setting the right-hand side of the type. Notice I can hide letters. So that functions pretty much the same way as area type would function. I'm closing down the amount of space or volume for that type by grabbing the right-hand side. The same is true of the left-hand side. If I move it, I can move that type along. And you'll notice that as I move it closer to the right side, it makes type disappear. I can even flip the type over to the other side. I'll try that in a sec. But we've got this center point. It's like an upside down T. We can move the entire thing. Ooh, look, I could do imagine doing an infographic or something for roller coasters. I can flip it to the other side. Upside down Leviathan. Woohoo! There you go. So that's type on a path. P for pen tool. And just to show you, we can also craft type Okay. So we can use type in a path. What have I done here? Let me just try it with that for a sec. Okay, let's see if that'll actually work. There we go. Sorry, I used this type inside a path. And let me just make it a little bit smaller. So you can see that text in a path could be confined within a design element. And I've just done a kind of basic outline of a bicycle seat here. And if you were doing a published article on cycling in the city, and you're a bike advocate or whatever, you could use this as an actual design element. So type being formed into or conformed to a specific shape that has some context with relation to what it is you're writing about. So that's type in a path. There's a number of functions there that you can explore. We now want to take a look at setting up paragraphs of type. So we'll just use the area type tool. We'll take a look at some other functions in type. It's probably best when working with type to go to Window, Workspace, Typography. And this gives you access to all the things that you're going to need, like your character menu, your character palette, paragraph palette, character styles, and paragraph styles. Now, we're going to take a look at some character basics right off the top. We can, of course, change the font, and we can also access, the existing libraries of fonts that are in there. But we also, through the Creative Cloud, have access to TypeKit fonts. And the way in which we can do that is if we log in, we go up to our Creative Cloud and log in with our credentials. And if I look under Assets and Fonts, I can see all of the Creative Cloud fonts that I have currently installed on my, my Creative Cloud license. But if there's another font that I want to look for, we can go to Manage Fonts. This might take a while because my system is syncing everything up to this local desktop system. But these are my fonts. I could search TypeKit for a particular font. Today we're going to be using one called Franklin Gothic. And you would select that font family. And then we could put some type in there. So you can put in whatever text it is that you want to look at. And the one that I want, these are $20 to purchase your own in perpetuity version. We're looking for this one right down here. Franklin Gothic URW Medium. We're going to need that later on. Don't worry if you haven't got it synced yet, but later on when we do the layout of the magazine article, you're going to need that Franklin Gothic. Now, so that's accessing TypeKit fonts. You'll notice that you've got a bunch of them in there already. And if we just take a look here, you'll notice that we've got all these fonts listed and they've got a little symbol beside each one. These are different font technologies. These TT ones here, it's not what you think it is. That stands for TrueType. That was a font technology that was developed by Microsoft and Apple Computer to break the monopoly that Adobe had on font technology. Whenever you bought a PC or a Mac system, the fonts that came in that system were created by Adobe. So every computer that you bought, they would have to pay a licensing fee to Adobe. And they sold their fonts, and they didn't like that, so they decided they'd work together and develop their own set. So that's TrueType. This one here is TypeKit. These are cloud-based fonts. They are never physically on your computer. They're always referenced to an Adobe TypeKit server, and they're available to you for as long as you're paying Adobe to be on their service, their Creative Cloud. Now, this one here is called Opentype. So that was an open standard where people could code and contribute to it, more along the lines with sort of other open coding architecture that we have in the open source community. And so we have a number of these different fonts that are loaded in here. Now the problem is that if you've created something using a TrueType font, there's no way to get that font to the person that you want to send it to unless they also have Creative Cloud with TrueType. With TypeKit. If they don't have Creative Cloud services, they're not going to be able to open it up and see that font that you've specified. But there are some workarounds. The other font technologies allow the fonts to be copied and passed along. However, this is ethically dubious and may actually be illegal in some places, not Canada. So that's a little diversion on font technology. And let's just, I'm just going to use the Franklin. I think I have it in here somewhere. Maybe not. Okay, I'm just going to use that. So we've got some type in here. And let's look at some of the controls that we have available to us. We can change the font, as we've already seen. We can choose a different level of emphasis within that font family. So we can make it bold. or we can make some of it italic. Sorry. Medium italic. We can make some of it condensed. So it's taking up less space. So already you can see the consequences of choosing different fonts and different members of that font family. This is really just a family name, and these are different members or subgroupings within that family. This is the point size. And this is the leading. So I'm just going to select all of this and show you. Notice it doesn't show a point size because it's a mixed bag of sizes, but I'm going to give them all a very specific leading. I just keep dropping that down, and notice that when we talk of leading, we're talking about this black area. That's really what we would call the slug. In old school typesetting, the type was created by pouring into a mold and creating a lead slug of that piece of type. And all those slugs would be the same height, and they would all slide together, and they'd be put together by a person called a compositor, and they would use a compositing stick, and by hand they would form all of those words in reverse. So these were people who lived their life 9 to 5 looking in a mirror at letters. They would compose the letters backwards because, as you know, once they were printed, the print is actually a reverse of the actual pieces of type, and you would get it printing the correct way. So they would composite all of that, and it was embedded into a lead slug the same height as this. As technology improved, machines like the Morgenthaler machine, the New York Times put out a competition for somebody who could invent a machine that could composite automatically a line of type in lead. And Morgenthaler devised this typesetting machine, the Linotype, meaning literally a line of type. And they became a huge type foundry in the United States. Linotype, still to the modern age, created imaging machines for type. It would be able to spit out an entire line of type. So leading actually has its roots in the fact that we have lead being used early on in the creation of printed type. The word font comes from it's the French for foundry. A font is a crucible that they would melt the lead down into and pour into the mold to create the pieces of type. So that's a little bit of history trivia for you. And the leading now, in order to create spaces between those lines of type, they would take little strips of lead and they would insert those little strips of lead between the type in that fashion, making the space between the lines more and more. So that's really the historical context for some of these terms. So we have the point size of the actual type, then we have the leading, and then we have that interline spacing that I was talking about. That's what we know to be leading. Really, the leading is the measure of the distance from the baseline. You see that invisible line that all the type seems to be sitting on, down to the next line or baseline of type. That distance from there to there is 25 points. And points and picas are a measurement system that are still in use today. As you can see, it's the default here for Illustrator when we're working with type. Other things that we can do with type. Let's expand this. Some other functions. We can increase character height. Let me just create a crazy percentage. So we're stretching the character, never a good idea. Why they even tempt you with this kind of nonsense is beyond me. It's an abomination. Sorry, that should be at 100%. Likewise, you can stretch the type. Why did I actually show this to you? Now, it'd be all manner of problems. We can do baseline shifting. Good for scientific and mathematical notation, or just for having fun. So we can shift things off the traditional baseline, just like that. We can take type and we can actually rotate it on its axis. Comme ça. Look at that. We can create type and make it all caps. I am Canadian. We can select and we can use small caps. We can select type and we can make it superscript. And we can select type and we can make it subscript. And then we can do underline type. Rarely do I use this kind of emphasis. Or we could do strike through type. Okay? All of these different things. We can also choose for ourselves the spellcheck language that we want to use. So if you're a fan of misspelling, you can use the default of USA. Or you use, and you've got to select all of that type, tell it which spelling dictionary. We should actually be using Latin. And Latin's a dead language, so it's not there. Greek's still going though.